January 17, 1943, the Solomon Sea, 3 miles east of Guadalcanal, the destroyer, USS Fletcher, cuts through black water under a moonless sky. The air hangs thick with tropical humidity, salt spray misting across the forward gun mount where a young ensign named Thomas Wardle grips the railing with white knuckles. No stars pierce the cloud cover overhead. No silhouettes break the horizon. In these waters, darkness is absolute, a void where steel ships become invisible phantoms, where the enemy could be 1,000 yards away or 10,000, and no human eye could tell the difference. Below deck, in a cramped compartment, barely 8 feet square, radar technician second-class Robert Chen stands before a circular cathode ray tube, its greenish glow the only light in the space. His eyes trace the sweep line as it rotates across the scope, painting ghost images of the coastline behind them. Then, at the edge of the display, a small luminous pip appears. Another sweep. The pip remains. Chen's hand moves to the intercom. His voice is steady, almost casual. Bridge, Combat Information Center. Surface contact bearing 045. Range 11,000 yards. On the bridge, Captain Harold Morrison receives this information with a calmness born from 6 months of hunting in these same waters. He does not raise binoculars to peer into the impenetrable night. He does not order searchlights activated, those beacons that would transform his ship into a perfect target. Instead, he speaks into the voice tube. Come right to all ahead flank, gun crews to battle stations. The destroyer heels into its turn, accelerating toward an enemy it cannot see, guided entirely by invisible radio. Waves bouncing off steel hulls somewhere in the darkness ahead. What happens in the next 23 minutes will not be decided by courage, or marksmanship, or even tactical brilliance. It will be decided by a technology that has given the United States Navy something unprecedented in the history of naval warfare: the ability to see in total darkness. The Japanese destroyer, Hotsuyuki, for miles ahead, has no idea it has been detected. Its lookouts scan the night with binoculars, searching for the telltale wake, phosphorescence, or funnel smoke that might betray an enemy's position. They see nothing. They cannot know that they are already being tracked, ranged, and targeted by a system so advanced that it exists beyond the boundaries of their tactical imagination. This is not a story about a single battle. This is the story of how American technology transformed the fundamental nature of warfare at sea, how it turned night from a shield into a killing ground, and how a device most sailors didn't understand and many officers initially distrusted became the decisive weapon in the Pacific War. It is the story of radar, the compact, high-frequency, fire-control radar that allowed American destroyers to hunt with a precision that their enemies could neither match nor comprehend. In the spring of 1940, as German tanks rolled across France and the Battle of Britain began to take shape in the skies over England, a small team of engineers at the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington, D.C. worked in relative obscurity on a problem that had vexed naval tacticians since the age of sail: how to fight effectively in darkness or poor visibility. For centuries, navies had understood that night combat was chaotic, brutal, and usually suicidal. Ships fired at muzzle flashes. Collisions were common. Friend and foe became indistinguishable in the confusion. The nation that could solve this problem would possess an advantage almost beyond calculation. The British had made the first breakthrough. Their early warning radar systems, operating on long wavelengths, could detect aircraft at considerable distances. These systems had proven invaluable during the Battle of Britain, giving Fighter Command precious minutes of warning before German bombers arrived over English cities. But these early radars were massive installations, requiring tall towers and consuming enormous amounts of electrical power. They could detect the presence of targets, but provided limited accuracy for targeting purposes. What the US Navy needed was something entirely different: a compact, seaborne system capable of not just detecting enemy ships, but providing firing solutions accurate enough for naval gunnery. The challenge was immense. Radar works by transmitting radio waves and measuring the time it takes for those waves to bounce back from distant objects. Longer wavelengths could travel farther but provided poor resolution and required large antennas. Shorter wavelengths, what engineers called microwave frequencies, could provide much better resolution and required smaller antennas. But generating sufficient power at these frequencies pushed the boundaries of existing technology. The device that could accomplish this would need to fit aboard a ship already crowded with guns, ammunition, fuel tanks, and crew quarters. It would need to survive the shock of naval gunfire, the corrosive salt environment, and the violent motion of a destroyer in heavy seas. And it would need to be reliable enough that commanders would stake their ships and their lives on the information it provided. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source, a British invention called the cavity magnetron, a device that could generate powerful microwave pulses in a package small enough to hold in 2 hands. In September 1940, a British technical mission arrived in Washington carrying one of these devices in a plain wooden box. What happened next represented one of the most significant technology transfers in history. The British, desperate for American industrial capacity and knowing they could not mass-produce radar systems while fighting for survival, shared their most advanced military technology. American engineers studied the magnetron with something approaching reverence. Within months, contracts went out to manufacturers. By early 1941, prototype systems were being tested at CDOT. The system that emerged from this collaboration was designated the Mark IV radar, later replaced by the improved Mark XII and Mark XXII models. To the sailors who operated them, they were simply the radar or sometimes the magic eye. The antenna, a rectangular dish roughly 4 feet across, rotated atop the ship's fire control director. Below deck, the transmitter generated pulses of microwave energy at a frequency of 3,000 megahertz, 10 times higher than earlier naval radars. The pulses lasted only a microsecond each, but in that microsecond, a radio wave traveled out from the ship at the speed of light, bounced off any metal object in its path, and returned to be captured by the receiver. Sophisticated circuitry measured the time delay with extraordinary precision, converted that measurement into range, and displayed the result on a cathode ray tube where operators could track multiple targets simultaneously. The Mark IV could detect a destroyer-sized target at 20,000 yards more than 11 miles, provide range information accurate to within 50 yards. In clear weather, in daylight, that might not seem revolutionary, but at night, in rain, in fog, or in the smoke and chaos of battle, it was transformative. An American destroyer equipped with this system could track enemy ships far beyond visual range, could maintain that track even if the enemy disappeared into a rain squall, and could direct its guns onto target with a precision that would have seemed like sorcery to naval officers of the previous generation. But technology alone does not win wars. The Mark IV radar was a masterpiece of engineering, but its true power would only be realized through the development of new tactics, new training methods, and a fundamental reimagining of how destroyers fought. The US Navy had to learn not just how to use radar, but how to think with radar, how to integrate this new sense into the operational DNA of the fleet. The destroyer sailors who first encountered radar in late 1941 and early 1942 regarded it with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. To the veteran chiefs and gunners' mates, who had spent years perfecting the art of visual range estimation and mechanical fire control, the idea that they should trust a glowing green screen seemed almost insulting. These were men who could estimate range by the height of an enemy's masts above the horizon, who could sense subtle changes in engine vibration that indicated a change in the target's speed. Now they were being told to ignore their instincts and followed the directions of a radar operator, often a young sailor, barely out of training school, sitting in a dark room, staring at a cathode ray tube. The radar operators themselves faced a steep learning curve. The images on their scopes were not photographs. They were abstract representations, luminous pips and smears of varying intensity that required interpretation and experience to understand. Land masses produced strong returns, but their shape on the scope rarely matched their appearance on a chart. Rain squalls created patches of clutter. Ships sometimes produced multiple echoes as the radar pulse bounced off different parts of the superstructure. Distinguishing a surfaced submarine from a floating log, or an enemy destroyer from a friendly patrol boat, required judgment honed through countless hours at the scope. Moreover, early radar systems were temperamental. Vacuum tubes overheated and burned out. Salt spray corroded electrical connections. The rotating antenna mechanisms jammed in heavy seas. Radar technicians became some of the most valuable and most overworked sailors in the fleet, crawling into cramped equipment spaces at all hours to replace failed components and keep the systems operational. There were nights when radar failed at critical moments, when commanders found themselves blind in the darkness. forced to fall back on the old methods of visual searching and intuition. These failures reinforced the skepticism of radar doubters, but gradually, through training and combat experience, a new generation of destroyer officers emerged who understood how to fight with radar. They learned to position their ships to keep the enemy illuminated on the scope, while minimizing their own radar signature. They learned that a skilled radar operator could detect subtle changes in a target's bearing rate that indicated the enemy was turning, giving precious seconds of warning before the maneuver became visible. They learned to coordinate radar tracking with visual observation, using each to verify and enhance the other. Most importantly, they learned to trust the technology even when instinct urged caution. The Combat Information Center, or CIC, became the brain of the modern warship. In earlier years, the captain commanded from the open bridge, where he could see and assess the tactical situation with his own eyes. But radar changed this. The CIC, located deep in the ship's interior, where it was protected from shell splinters and machine gun fire, became the primary command space during night actions. Here, officers stood over plotting tables where sailors marked the positions of friendly and enemy ships based on radar reports. Status boards tracked ammunition expenditure, damage reports, and fuel status. Radio operators monitored multiple frequencies simultaneously, coordinating with other ships in the formation and receiving orders from the task force commander. The captain still went to the bridge during action, but increasingly he made his decisions based on information synthesized in the CIC rather than what he could see through binoculars. This transition was cultural as much as tactical. The destroyer navy had always prized aggressive, intuitive leadership captains who could read a tactical situation at a glance and react with instant decision. Radar required a different kind of warfare, more calculated, more dependent on technical information, requiring a degree of patience that could feel unnatural when every instinct urged immediate action. Some officers adapted brilliantly. Others, particularly those who had learned their craft in the pre-war navy, struggled to trust information that came filtered through electronic systems and junior personnel rather than their own experienced eyes. But combat has a way of resolving doctrinal disputes. In the nighttime destroyer actions around Guadalcanal in late 1942, American ships equipped with radar consistently detected enemy forces first, achieved firing solutions faster, and scored hits with their opening salvos, while Japanese destroyers were still searching for targets. The battles of Cape Esperance, Tassafaronga, and Kula Gulf became case studies in the tactical advantage conferred by radar. American commanders who mastered the technology survived and were promoted. Those who did not often lost their ships. By mid-1943, radar dominance was no longer a theoretical advantage. It was the operational reality that defined every surface engagement in the Pacific. The Japanese Imperial Navy had been aware of radar technology since before the war. Japanese scientists had experimented with radio detection systems in the late 1930s, and Japanese intelligence had gathered information about British and German radar development. But the Imperial Navy never prioritized radar with the same urgency as the Allies. And when Japanese radar systems did enter service, they lagged far behind in capability. There were technical reasons for this disparity. Japan's electronics industry was less advanced, and the shortage of certain rare materials made it difficult to manufacture high-quality components. But there were also cultural and doctrinal factors. The Imperial Navy's tactical doctrine emphasized spiritual qualities, fighting spirit, night combat training, superior optics over technological solutions. Japanese destroyers were equipped with exceptionally powerful binoculars and telescopes, and their crews underwent rigorous training in night vision adaptation. Before entering combat waters, Japanese sailors would spend hours in darkened compartments, allowing their eyes to fully adjust to low light conditions. The Navy took pride in its prowess at night fighting, viewing it as an arena where Japanese spiritual superiority and intensive training would offset American material advantages. To invest heavily in radar seemed almost an admission of inferiority, a suggestion that Japanese sailors needed electronic assistance to match what their eyes and instincts should provide. Moreover, the Imperial Navy's early successes reinforced this confidence. In the night surface actions of 1942 around Guadalcanal, Japanese destroyers and cruisers achieved several stunning victories despite facing numerically superior American forces. At the Battle of Savo Island in August 1942, a Japanese cruiser force surprised and devastated an Allied naval force, sinking 4 cruisers in less than an hour. The victory owed more to good intelligence, aggressive tactics, and Allied command failures than to Japanese night vision. But it reinforced the perception that traditional methods remained effective. So when Japanese lookouts on the destroyer Hotsuyuki peer into the darkness of the Solomon Sea on that January night in 1943, they are confident in their equipment and their training. They have the finest optical equipment in the world. They have practiced night combat more rigorously than any navy in history. What they do not have, what they cannot even conceptualize, is the awareness that they are being observed by a system that operates on principles fundamentally different from human vision. The Hotsu is running at 28 knots, part of a Tokyo Express run to resupply Japanese forces on Guadalcanal. These high-speed nighttime missions have become the lifeline for the Japanese garrison, bringing troops and supplies while avoiding the American air superiority that dominates daylight hours. The crew is experienced, battle-tested. They have made this run a dozen times. Their captain, Commander Saburo Takahashi, stands on the bridgewing, binoculars pressed to his eyes, scanning the darkness. His lookouts are positioned at strategic points around the ship, their night-adapted eyes searching for any sign of enemy vessels. The sea is empty. The night is theirs. At 11,000 yards 6 nautical miles, the radio waves from USS Fletcher's Mark IV radar pulse into the darkness, strike the steel hull of Hotsuyuki, and return to the receiver. The target is acquired. In the Fletcher's CIC, the radar operator updates his plot. The fire control computer, a mechanical analog device of gears and cams, begins calculating a firing solution. It factors in the target's speed and bearing, the Fletcher's own speed and course, the ballistic properties of 5-inch shells, even the wind speed and direction. Within 90 seconds, it produces a solution. The main battery director, slaved to the radar, swings smoothly toward the target, bearing even though no one aboard the Fletcher can actually see the enemy ship. Captain Morrison makes his decision. They were close to 6,000 yards before opening fire, close enough to ensure devastating accuracy, but not so close that the Japanese can respond effectively. Even after the first salvo reveals the Fletcher's position, the destroyer continues its high-speed approach. On the Hotsuyuki, the lookouts see nothing. No silhouette, no wake, no smoke. The Japanese destroyer maintains its course, unaware that it has been stalked, ranged, and targeted. At 0247 hours, USS Fletcher opens fire. The first salvo of 5-inch shells, 5 rounds fired in a tight pattern, arcs through the night sky. The shells have been in the air for 17 seconds when they descend on Hotsuyuki. 2 shells miss, geysering into the sea 50 yards off the port beam. 3 shells hit. 1 penetrates the forward deckhouse, detonating among ammunition lockers. Another strikes the base of the forward smokestack, shearing through steam lines. The third hits just above the waterline amidships, opening the hull to the sea. For the crew of Hotsuyuki, the experience is nightmarish. There was no warning, no searchlight beam, no muzzle flash on the horizon to indicate an enemy's position. The shells simply arrived out of the darkness, as if materialized from nothing. The ship's damage control parties respond with practiced efficiency, fighting fires and shoring up damaged compartments. But before they can assess the full extent of the damage, a second salvo arrives, then a third. The Fletcher's radar maintains perfect tracking even as the Japanese destroyer attempts to turn away, even as smoke and steam obscure the target. The American 5-inch guns fire with metronomic precision, their shells walking up the length of the Japanese ship. Commander Takahashi orders his searchlights activated in desperation, sweeping the beams across the water in hope of spotting the attacker. The powerful lights briefly illuminate USS Fletcher, now at 4,000 yards and closing. Takahashi orders his guns to open fire, but the Hotsuyuki's fire control system depends on visual range estimation, and in the confusion of damage and darkness, the Japanese gunnery solutions are wildly inaccurate. Their shells fall long and short, wide left and wide right. A few pass close enough that the Fletcher's crew can hear the distinctive whine of passing projectiles, but none hit. The Fletcher continues its methodical bombardment. 13 minutes after the engagement began, Hotsuyuki is dead in the water, burning from stem to stern. Commander Takahashi, his bridge destroyed, and most of his senior officers dead, gives the order to abandon ship. The destroyer capsizes 22 minutes later and sinks in 3,000 feet of water. 147 members of her crew go down with her. The survivors who make it into the water watch as USS Fletcher, its work completed, turns south and disappears into the darkness with the same ghostly silence with which it had appeared. Not a single shell had struck the American destroyer. The engagement had been utterly one-sided, not because of superior courage or better seamanship, but because the Americans had fought with a sense the Japanese simply did not possess. In the 18 months that followed, this pattern repeated itself across the Pacific. American destroyers, equipped with increasingly sophisticated radar systems and commanded by officers who had learned to exploit this technology to its fullest potential, achieved a degree of dominance in night surface combat that would have been unthinkable in 1941. The statistics are stark. In night surface engagements after mid-1943, American destroyers achieved first hit rates exceeding 70%. They struck the enemy with their opening salvos in more than 2 out of 3 battles. By contrast, Japanese first hit rates dropped below 20%. The disparity was not just significant, it was decisive. The Mark 12 and Mark 22 radar systems that became standard on American destroyers by late 1943 represented substantial improvements over the earlier Mark 4. They provided better resolution, could track more targets simultaneously, and were more reliable. But the real advantage came not from incremental technical improvements, but from the integration of radar into every aspect of destroyer operations. American destroyers developed new formations designed to maximize radar coverage. They practiced radar-directed gunnery until it became second nature. They created specialized combat information center teams who trained together until they could interpret radar displays with extraordinary sophistication. One of the most significant tactical innovations was the practice of radar-controlled torpedo attacks. American destroyers carried powerful Mark 15 torpedoes with ranges exceeding 10,000 yards. In the early war period, launching these torpedoes effectively at night had been nearly impossible. Commanders had to estimate range visually and calculate the firing solution using tables and mental arithmetic, all while maneuvering at high speed in darkness. Radar changed this completely. A destroyer could track an enemy force on radar, calculate precise ranges and bearings, and launch torpedoes with a fire control solution as accurate as any achieved in daylight. The Japanese never developed an effective counter to these tactics. Their own long-lance torpedoes were technologically longer ranged, more powerful, but without radar to direct them. Japanese destroyers struggled to employ them effectively in night engagements. The psychological impact on Japanese destroyer crews was profound. Night combat had been an arena where they felt confident, where their training and spirit could offset American material superiority. Now that arena had become a killing ground where American ships struck from beyond visual range with uncanny accuracy. Japanese destroyer captains began to exhibit increasing caution in night operations. They maintained higher speeds, making themselves harder to track, but also consuming more fuel and wearing out their machinery. They increased the frequency of their maneuvers, hoping that constant course changes would degrade American radar tracking. Sometimes these measures helped, but more often they simply delayed the inevitable. Japanese naval intelligence recognized the radar threat and attempted to develop countermeasures. By 1944, Japanese ships began to be fitted with basic radar warning receivers, devices that could detect the electromagnetic pulses from American radar and provide warning that the ship was being tracked. This was better than nothing, but it did not solve the fundamental problem. Knowing you were being tracked did not tell you where the enemy was, or how many ships you faced, or what your own ship's position was relative to theirs. It simply confirmed what Japanese sailors increasingly suspected, that they were entering battle at a severe disadvantage. Some Japanese commanders attempted to turn American radar superiority against itself. They would maneuver their ships close to islands or coastlines, hoping that the landmass would create clutter on American radar scopes and mask their presence. Sometimes this worked. Trader operators of 1943 and 1944 still struggled to distinguish ships from land in complex island environments, but American radar technology continued to evolve. The introduction of Planned Position Indicator, or PPI, displays in late 1943 gave radar operators a top-down map view of the tactical situation, making it much easier to track targets near land. Moving target indicator technology helped filter out stationary returns and highlight moving ships. Each technical improvement closed another tactical option for the Japanese. By 1945, American destroyers were operating with near impunity in waters the Japanese had once controlled. They bombarded shore installations at night with the same precision they had once reserved for daylight operations. They intercepted Japanese supply runs with regularity. They formed radar picket lines that provided early warning of Japanese air attacks, then directed their anti-aircraft fire with radar-controlled predictors that could track aircraft through clouds and darkness. The destroyer, which had begun the war as primarily a torpedo platform, had evolved into a multi-role platform whose effectiveness derived directly from its electronic sensors and fire control systems. The radar scope itself became a symbolic object in the American destroyer fleet, a green oracle that could pierce darkness and distance, a technological embodiment of American industrial and scientific prowess. Sailors developed an almost superstitious attachment to their radar systems. They gave them nicknames, attributed personalities to them, cursed them when they malfunctioned, and praised them when they performed. Radar technicians, once near the bottom of the Navy's informal hierarchy, found themselves among the most respected members of the crew. A destroyer might limp into port with damaged guns or a twisted propeller, but if the radar was down, the ship was considered not ready for combat. The training regimen for radar operators became increasingly sophisticated. The Navy established schools where operators practiced on simulators, learning to interpret complex returns and distinguish genuine targets from clutter. They studied the radar characteristics of different ship types, how a destroyer's return differed from a cruiser's, how a submarine's conning tower produced a distinctive sharp spike on the scope. They learned to estimate target speeds by watching how quickly the pips moved across the display between sweeps. The best operators developed an intuitive understanding of their equipment, a sense of when the scope was showing them something unusual or important. Officers learned to read the radar picture as fluently as they once read the sea itself. A skilled commanding officer could stand in the CIC, watch the radar plot develop, and build a complete mental model of the tactical situation where enemy forces were, what they were doing, what they were likely to do next. This required a different kind of situational awareness than the traditional open bridge command style, but it was no less demanding and no less effective. The most successful destroyer captains of the late war period were often those who had fully embraced this new paradigm, who thought in terms of radar ranges and bearing rates. Rather than visual estimates, the radar scope also represented something larger, a manifestation of the American approach to warfare that emphasized technological solutions and industrial capacity, where the Japanese Navy had relied on intensive training and spiritual preparation to achieve night-fighting superiority. The American Navy had engineered a solution where the Japanese had trusted their eyes and instincts. The Americans had built a machine that could see farther and more accurately than any human. This reflected a fundamental difference in how the two nations approached the war. Japan, resource-poor and industrially limited, had to maximize the effectiveness of each ship and sailor through training and doctrine. America, with its vast industrial base and technological infrastructure, could afford to equip every destroyer with sophisticated electronics and train crews to use them effectively. This American faith in technology was not naive or misplaced. The radar systems worked. They were reliable enough for operational use, accurate enough for fire control, and compact enough to install on ships already crowded with weapons and equipment. Moreover, American industry proved capable of producing them in quantity. By war's end, not just destroyers, but destroyer escorts, patrol craft, even PT boats carried radar. What had been a rare and precious capability in 1942 had become ubiquitous by 1945. This mass production of high technology cliff meant the ability to maintain and operate it across thousands of miles of ocean was perhaps as important as the technology itself. The green glow of the radar scope became a kind of talisman, a reminder that American ships carried more than guns and torpedoes into battle. They carried the accumulated knowledge of American scientists and engineers, the productive capacity of American factories, the training expertise of American schools and bases. When a radar operator tracked an enemy ship at 10 miles range on a moonless night, he was wielding a capability that represented thousands of hours of research and development, millions of dollars of investment, and the coordinated efforts of contractors, technicians, and trainers scattered across the United States. The radar scope was not just a piece of equipment, it was a lens through which American power projected itself across the Pacific. The transformation in destroyer warfare went beyond tactics and technology. It changed how sailors understood their own role in the war. The destroyer crews of 1941 had been trained to fight with guns and torpedoes, to close with the enemy and slug it out in violent, close-range engagements where courage and seamanship determined the outcome. The destroyer crews of 1944 and 1945 fought a different kind of war. They hunted enemy ships from beyond visual range, directed their fire based on electronic information, and often sank targets they had never actually seen with their own eyes. This created a strange psychological distance from combat. A radar operator might track a target for 20 minutes, watch it maneuver on the scope, see it slow, and finally stop after multiple salvos struck home, and never once glimpse the actual ship or its crew. The green pip on the scope was an abstraction, a mathematical representation of a vessel somewhere over the horizon. When that pip faded from the display, the operator knew intellectually that men had just died, that a ship built at enormous cost and effort had been destroyed. But the emotional immediacy of that knowledge was muted by the electronic interface. This was not the warfare of Trafalgar or Jutland, where sailors saw the enemy's faces and heard the screams of wounded men. This was something new, cleaner, more efficient, and somehow more terrible in its clinical precision. Yet for all the technological sophistication, destroyer warfare remained intensely dangerous. Radar could not protect a ship from torpedoes or shellfire once battle was joined. It could not prevent mechanical breakdowns or human errors. American destroyers were still sunk, still suffered catastrophic damage, still lost crew members in numbers that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. The radar gave American destroyers a decisive advantage, but it was not a shield, it was a weapon that had to be wielded skillfully by crews who understood that mistakes would be punished instantly and lethally. The destroyer sailors themselves remained a breed apart. They were younger on average than the crews of battleships or cruisers, often just months out of training when they first went into combat. They lived in cramped quarters, worked exhausting watches, and endured conditions of discomfort that would have been intolerable to civilian standards. But they also developed an intense pride in their ships and their capabilities. Destroyer sailors knew that they were the tip of the spear, that when surface combat erupted, it was destroyers that would be first into action. The radar gave them confidence, not the false confidence of invulnerability, but the well-founded confidence of men who knew they possessed a significant advantage, and had the training to exploit it. The stories they told when they returned to port often centered on radar. They spoke of tracking enemy formations through rain squads, of detecting targets at what seemed impossible ranges, of watching the radar display as friendly ships maneuvered into perfect attack position while the enemy remained oblivious. These were not the traditional sea stories of hand-to-hand combat or daring maneuvers under fire, but they were no less compelling for that. They were stories about how technology and training combined to create a new kind of naval warrior, one who fought with electrons and cathode rays as well as shells and torpedoes. The Japanese never closed the radar gap, despite increasing awareness of their disadvantage, despite captured equipment and intelligence reports, despite the obvious tactical implications. The Imperial Navy never fielded radar systems comparable to American equipment. Part of this failure was technical. Japanese industry struggled to produce high-quality microwave components in quantity. Part was economic. By 1944, American submarines and aircraft had so devastated Japanese merchant shipping that basic materials were in short supply, let alone specialized electronics components. But part was also institutional and cultural. The Imperial Navy had invested heavily in a particular vision of naval warfare, emphasizing spiritual qualities and traditional skills. To fully embrace radar would have required acknowledging that this vision was obsolete, that the carefully cultivated superiority in night combat was now a liability rather than an advantage. Some Japanese naval officers recognized this clearly. After-action reports from late-war destroyer actions contained blunt assessments of the radar disadvantage and its tactical consequences. But recognition did not translate into capability. The factories that could have produced sophisticated radar sets were instead producing aircraft, or submarines, or simply trying to replace ships lost faster than they could be replaced. The engineers who could have developed improved electronics were scattered, killed in air raids, or drafted into other projects. By 1944, the question was not whether Japanese destroyers could match American radar. capabilities they could not and would not, but whether they could continue functioning at all in the face of overwhelming American naval superiority. The last major surface engagement involving Japanese destroyers occurred in October 1944 at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, where remnants of the combined fleet made a desperate attempt to disrupt the American invasion of the Philippines. Even there, in what was supposed to be a climactic confrontation, Japanese destroyers found themselves operating at a severe disadvantage. American destroyers detected them at long range, tracked them through darkness and rain, and engaged them with a precision that Japanese crews could not counter. The battle demonstrated with finality that surface combat in the Pacific had become a contest that Japanese could not win. In the final months of the war, Japanese destroyers increasingly avoided surface combat entirely. They operated as fast transports, evacuating garrisons from doomed islands, or as anti-submarine escorts for the remnants of the merchant fleet. When they did encounter American surface forces, the engagements were brief and usually disastrous. The Imperial Navy had lost not just technological parity, but tactical confidence. The night, which had once been their domain, now belonged to the Americans. The impact of radar extended far beyond the immediate tactical results of individual engagements. The technology fundamentally altered the strategic calculus of the Pacific War. American destroyers, equipped with radar and operating with near impunity at night, could interdict Japanese supply lines, bombard shore installations, and support amphibious operations with a freedom of action that would have been impossible in an earlier era. The Tokyo Express runs that had sustained Japanese garrisons in the Solomons became increasingly costly and eventually unsustainable. Islands that might have held out for months with adequate resupply fell within weeks when American destroyers cut their lifelines. The psychological impact on Japanese forces was perhaps equally significant. Soldiers on bypassed islands, watching their supply ships hunted and sunk by invisible American forces, came to understand that their situation was hopeless. Sailors on Japanese destroyers, facing American ships that could strike from beyond visual range with devastating accuracy, began to doubt the propaganda that claimed Japanese spiritual superiority would overcome American materialism. The radar-equipped American destroyer became a symbol of the overwhelming technological and industrial advantage that Japan could not match. Historians, examining the Pacific War, have sometimes focused on the dramatic carrier battles Midway, Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf as the decisive engagements. These were indeed crucial, but the war was won as much in the accumulated effects of hundreds of smaller actions: convoy battles, shore bombardments, anti-submarine patrols, and nighttime surface engagements. In these actions, the destroyer was the primary American combatant, and radar was the primary American advantage. The technology transformed the humble destroyer from a supporting vessel into a war-winning platform. Moreover, the radar revolution in destroyer warfare anticipated the trajectory of naval development for decades to come. The Combat Information Center, created to exploit radar, became the standard command space in modern warships. The integration of sensors, computers, and weapons that began with World War II radar evolved into the sophisticated command and control systems of contemporary navies. The principle that information superiority could be as valuable as firepower, superiority perhaps more valuable, became foundational to modern naval doctrine. When we look at an Aegis destroyer today, with its phased array radars and distributed computing systems, we are seeing the direct descendant of USS Fletcher and her sisters, hunting in the darkness of the Solomon Sea in 1943. The story of radar and destroyer warfare is also a story about adaptation and learning. The U.S. Navy of 1941 had to undergo a fundamental transformation in how it thought about combat. Officers trained in traditional methods had to learn to trust technology they didn't fully understand. Sailors had to master equipment that existed at the cutting edge of contemporary science. Organizations had to develop new doctrines, new training programs, new maintenance procedures, all while fighting a desperate war across the largest ocean on Earth. That they succeeded, and succeeded so thoroughly, speaks to institutional flexibility and a willingness to embrace innovation that was itself a crucial factor in Allied victory. Robert Chen, the radar operator who first detected Hotsuyuki that January night in 1943, survived the war. He participated in 17 surface engagements aboard USS Fletcher. tracking targets in conditions ranging from clear tropical nights to typhoon-force storms. After the war, he returned to California, earned an engineering degree on the GI Bill, and spent 30 years working in the electronics industry. In an oral history interview conducted in 1982, he reflected on his time as a radar operator. "We knew we had an advantage. We could see them and they couldn't see us. But I don't think we really understood how big an advantage that was until later, when we learned how one-sided those battles really were. At the time, you're just doing your job, tracking the targets, calling out the ranges. You don't think about the bigger picture. But looking back now, I realize we were part of something that changed naval warfare forever." That quiet assessment captures something essential about technological revolution in wartime. The sailors who operated the radar and the officers who learned to exploit it were not thinking about historical significance or doctrinal transformation. They were focused on immediate tactical problems, keeping the equipment working, interpreting the returns on the scope, providing accurate information to territory-scansion crews who depended on them. Yet in solving these immediate problems, they were collectively executing a revolution in naval warfare as profound as the introduction of steam power or the battleship itself. Captain Harold Morrison, commanding officer of USS Fletcher, during that engagement with Hotsuyuki, went on to command a destroyer squadron and later a cruiser division. In his post-war memoir, published in 1957, he wrote, "The radar gave us eyes in the darkness, but it required more than that to win battles. It required crews who believed in the equipment, who understood its capabilities and limitations, who could think in terms of ranges and bearings rather than visual observation. The technology was necessary, but not sufficient." What made American destroyers effective was the combination of excellent equipment and sailors who knew how to use it. This combination, advanced technology expertly employed, became the hallmark of American naval power in the latter half of the 20th century. The destroyer fleet that emerged from World War II was fundamentally different from the one that entered it. Destroyers had evolved from torpedo boats and screening vessels into multi-mission platforms capable of anti-submarine warfare, anti-aircraft defense, shore bombardment, and surface combat. At the heart of this transformation was the integration of electronic sensors and fire control systems, beginning with radar but eventually encompassing sonar, electronic warfare equipment, and satellite communications. The veterans who served on those radar-equipped destroyers carried the lessons of that experience into the post-war Navy and into civilian life. They became the engineers who designed the next generation of naval electronics. They became the instructors who taught new sailors how to interpret sensor data and make tactical decisions based on electronic information. They became the defense contractors and Pentagon planners who shaped American naval strategy during the Cold War. The institutional knowledge they accumulated, how to fight with sensors, how to train operators, how to maintain complex electronics at sea, became embedded in American naval practice. In the winter of 1945, as the war entered its final months, American destroyers ranged the Western Pacific with an assurance that would have seemed impossible 4 years earlier. They operated in waters once considered the exclusive domain of the Imperial Navy, hunting the remnants of Japanese naval power with methodical efficiency. The radar scopes that had once seemed mysterious now displayed a picture that operators could read as fluently as a printed page. The green glow illuminated not just the tactical situation but the trajectory of naval warfare itself, a trajectory that led inexorably toward increasing dependence on electronic systems and decreasing reliance on visual observation. Japanese destroyer Yukikaze, one of the few to survive the war intact, surrendered to American forces in August 1945. American technical officers came aboard to inspect her equipment, seeking to understand how the enemy had fought and what capabilities they had possessed. What they found confirmed what the tactical results had already demonstrated. Japanese radar lagged far behind American systems in capability and sophistication. The sets installed on Yukikaze could detect surface targets at perhaps 8 yards under ideal conditions, less than half the range of American Mark 12 radar. The displays were crude, the resolution poor, the reliability suspect. A Japanese destroyer equipped with this radar was not fighting on equal terms with an American destroyer. It was fighting a fundamentally different kind of battle. The American officers who conducted that inspection understood that they were looking at the physical manifestation of industrial and technological disparity. The radar set on Yukikaze represented the best the Japanese electronics industry could produce under wartime conditions. It simply wasn't good enough, and no amount of fighting spirit or tactical skill could compensate for that inadequacy. The lesson was clear. In modern naval warfare, technological superiority translated directly into tactical dominance and operational success. This lesson resonated far beyond the Pacific theater. British and Soviet naval officers studied American radar technology and tactics, seeking to incorporate similar capabilities into their own fleets. In the emerging Cold War, radar dominance became a prerequisite for naval power. The principles developed by American destroyer crews in the Solomon Islands and Philippine Sea sensor-directed combat, information integration, coordinated operations became foundational concepts for the navies of NATO and the Warsaw Pact. The destroyers themselves, those steel greyhounds that had hunted through Pacific darkness, mostly met prosaic ends. Some were scrapped in the late 1940s and early 1950s as the Navy downsized after the war. Others were modernized and served through the Korean War and into the 1960s. Their World War II-era radar replaced by newer systems, but their basic design still sound. A few were transferred to Allied navies and served for decades more. USS Fletcher herself was decommissioned in 1969 after 27 years of service and sold for scrap in 1972. The radar mast that had once rotated in the darkness above Guadalcanal was cut down with a torch. The Combat Information Center where Robert Chen had tracked Hotsuyuki was dismantled. The ship that had embodied a revolution in naval warfare became ingots of recycled steel. But the legacy endured. Every modern warship is, in a sense, a descendant of those radar-equipped destroyers. The bridge wings where lookouts once stood with binoculars are now largely empty. The watch is kept by electronic sensors that never tire, never lose concentration, and can detect threats far beyond the range of human vision. The Combat Information Center, once an improvised adaptation to new technology, has become the command center of the modern warship, a space filled with displays and computers where officers conduct combat operations based on data from dozens of sensors. The faith that American destroyer crews learned to place in their radar scopes, the trust in electronic information over direct observation, has become the norm. Throughout the world's navies, the technological lineage is direct and traceable. The microwave radar of 1943 led to improved post-war systems, which led to phased array radars, which led to the Aegis combat system, which led to the integrated air and missile defense networks of contemporary warships. Each generation built on the lessons of the previous, refining the technology, improving the integration, expanding the capabilities, but the fundamental concept remained constant. A warship is first and foremost a sensor platform, a vessel that fights by perceiving its environment more accurately, and at greater range than the enemy can perceive his. There is something both remarkable and unsettling about how thoroughly technology transformed destroyer warfare in just 4 years. The destroyer sailors of 1941, peering into darkness with binoculars and relying on instinct, would have struggled to recognize the destroyer warfare of 1945, where sailors in darkened compartments made life-and-death decisions based on glowing displays. The change came with startling speed, driven by the urgency of war and enabled by industrial capacity. It demonstrated both the power of American innovation and the vulnerability of any military force that failed to keep pace with technological change. For the Japanese destroyer sailors who faced radar-equipped American ships in the final years of the war, the experience must have been profoundly demoralizing. They had trained for years to achieve superiority in night combat. They had practiced until they could estimate ranges and bearings in darkness with remarkable accuracy. They had developed tactics designed to exploit their night fighting skills. And then they encountered an enemy who simply did not fight the same way, who struck from ranges and in conditions where traditional skills were irrelevant. It was not that their training was inadequate, it was that their training prepared them for a kind of combat that no longer existed. This is perhaps the most profound lesson of the radar revolution in destroyer warfare. That technological change can render entire doctrines obsolete, seemingly overnight. The Imperial Navy had invested enormous resources in night combat training, believing it would provide a crucial advantage. That belief was reasonable based on the naval warfare of the 1930s, but technology moved faster than doctrine could adapt. By the time Japanese planners fully recognized the implications of American radar superiority, it was too late to respond effectively. The war had entered a new phase, and the rules had changed in ways that favored American strengths and exploited Japanese weaknesses. The green glow of the radar scope, then, became not just a tactical tool but a symbol of modernity itself, of the triumph of science and industry over tradition and training, of information dominance over physical courage. It represented a new kind of warfare where battles were won before the enemy even knew they were engaged, where superior perception mattered more than superior spirit. For a navy that prided itself on fighting spirit and traditional warrior virtues, this was a bitter lesson. On a moonless night in January 1943, USS Fletcher proved that darkness was no longer a shield, but merely another environment to be mastered through technology. The destroyer that cut through black water toward an unseen enemy was not just hunting a single Japanese ship, it was demonstrating a principle that would shape naval warfare for generations to come. The ability to see farther, more clearly, and with greater precision than the enemy was not just an advantage, it was decisive. The sailors who operated those early radar systems could not have known the full historical significance of what they were doing. They were focused on immediate concerns, keeping the equipment running, interpreting the returns, providing accurate information. But in aggregate, across hundreds of ships and thousands of engagements, their efforts amounted to a revolution. They were learning to fight in a new way, developing tactics and procedures that would become standard practice, proving that electronic sensors could be trusted in the most demanding circumstances imaginable. Robert Chen, standing in that cramped CIC compartment, watching the green sweep line rotate across his scope, was not thinking about naval history or technological revolution. He was thinking about the bearing and range to target, about whether the pip on his screen represented one ship or two, about making sure his voice came across clearly on the intercom when he reported to the bridge. But in doing that job, and doing it well, he was part of something larger, transformation in how navies fought and how wars were won. The destroyer Fletcher would go on to earn 15 battle stars for her World War II service. Participating in every major campaign from the Solomons to Okinawa, she survived kamikaze attacks, typhoons, and countless surface engagements. But perhaps her most significant contribution came not from any single battle, but from what she represented, a new kind of warship, built around electronic sensors as much as guns and torpedoes, capable of fighting with a precision that earlier generations could not have imagined. When Hotsuyuki slipped beneath the waves that January night, she carried with her not just a crew and a ship, but an entire way of warfare, the Imperial Navy's faith in night fighting superiority, its emphasis on optical excellence and intensive training, its belief that spirit could overcome material disadvantage. All these went down with her. What remained, floating in the darkness above the wreck, was USS Fletcher, her radar still sweeping, her crew already preparing to return to patrol. The destroyer continued on through the night, its radar painting the coastline of Guadalcanal on the scope, green light illuminating the faces of sailors who had just changed the nature of naval combat forever and were already moving on to the next task. The story of radar-equipped American destroyers is not just a story about technology. It is a story about adaptation, about learning, about the willingness to trust new methods even when they contradicted established practice. It is a story about the thousands of sailors who mastered unfamiliar equipment, the engineers who kept that equipment running under impossible conditions, and the officers who developed new tactics to exploit new capabilities. It is a story about industrial capacity and scientific innovation, about a nation that could design, produce, and deploy sophisticated electronics on hundreds of ships while simultaneously fighting a global war. But above all, it is a story about how information became the decisive factor in modern warfare. The destroyer equipped with radar possessed something more valuable than heavier guns or faster speed. It possessed superior awareness of the tactical environment. It could see the enemy first, track him accurately, and strike him effectively while remaining invisible. This principle that superior information enables superior action would become the foundation of military doctrine in the electronic age. The radar scope was the first manifestation of this principle at sea, but it would not be the last dot in the decades that followed World War II. The descendants of those radar-equipped destroyers would carry increasingly sophisticated sensors into increasingly complex operational environments, Radar would be joined by sonar, by electronic warfare equipment, by satellite communications and data links that could share information across entire fleets. The Combat Information Center would evolve into a networked command space where data from multiple sources fused into a comprehensive tactical picture. The destroyer would become a node in a larger information network, contributing its sensors and receiving information from others, operating as part of an integrated system rather than as an individual ship. But the fundamental principle established in the darkness of the Solomon Sea in 1943 remained constant. The side that can perceive the battlefield more accurately and at greater range possesses an advantage that skill and courage alone cannot overcome. USS Fletcher and her sisters proved this principle in combat, demonstrating that electronics and engineering could be as decisive as gunnery and seamanship. They wrote a new chapter in the long history of naval warfare, one where the glowing green line of a radar scope became as important as the shine of polished brass and the crack of gunfire. The sailors who fought that war are mostly gone now, passing into history along with the ships they served, but the legacy of what they accomplished endures in every modern warship that puts to sea, in every combat information center where watch officers make decisions based on electronic data, in every engagement where superior information proves decisive. The revolution they participated in, often without fully realizing its significance, fundamentally changed how navies fight and how wars are won. On silent nights at sea, when modern destroyers patrol distant waters with their sophisticated radar arrays sweeping the horizon, they stand as monuments to those earlier ships and earlier sailors. The technology has advanced beyond anything the crews of USS Fletcher could have imagined, but the principle remains the same. Darkness is no longer a shield. Distance is no longer safety. The ability to see, to know, to understand the tactical situation with precision and certainty, this is the true weapon. More powerful than guns or torpedoes, more decisive than speed or armor. And it all began with a green glow in a darkened compartment, a rotating antenna atop a destroyer's mast, and a young radar operator calling out bearing and range to a target he could not see but could track with perfect clarity. In that moment, naval warfare entered the modern age, and it has never looked back.